When my grandfather died without leaving a will, my father inherited a massive corporate empire and made sure I knew my exact place. At a lavish celebration dinner, he slid a $15,000 bill across the table, laughed in my face, and told me I would not see a single cent of the family money while crowning my brother the sole heir. What he did not know was that a stranger was about to walk through those private dining room doors and hand me an envelope that would destroy his entire kingdom. I am Sydney, 33 years old, and to my family, I am just a mediocre mid-level financial analyst. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who thought they could walk all over you. The private dining room at the Sovereign, one of Chicago's most exclusive and ridiculously expensive steakhouses, smelled of white truffles, aged bourbon, and unearned arrogance. My father, Richard, who had just turned 60, was holding court at the head of a massive mahogany table. He had invited a dozen of his closest sycophants, golf buddies, and junior executives to feast on Wagyu beef and imported caviar. He was celebrating what he considered the greatest victory of his life, a victory he did absolutely nothing to actually earn. My grandfather, Theodore, the brilliant and ruthless founder of a massive logistics and real estate empire that stretched across the Midwest, had passed away unexpectedly just 1 month ago. For decades, my grandfather had ruled his company with an iron fist, building his fortune from a single delivery truck into a multi-billion-dollar syndicate. But when he died, the family lawyers delivered a shocking piece of news to my father. My grandfather had died intestate, meaning he left no official will behind. By default under state law, my father, as the sole surviving son, inherited absolutely everything. The entire corporate empire, the downtown high-rises, the sprawling warehouses, the fleets of trucks, and the staggering bank accounts all fell directly into Richard's lap without a single legal battle. My father never hid his deep-seated disdain for me. In his eyes, women were liabilities useful only for looking pretty at corporate galas or marrying off to strategic business partners. Because I refused to play that game, I became the family scapegoat. I was the quiet, invisible daughter who lived in a modest rented apartment and worked a boring corporate job analyzing data spreadsheets. He treated me like a disappointment, a failure who lacked the aggressive business instincts required to carry the family name. My younger brother Bradley, who had just turned 30, was the exact opposite. Bradley was the ultimate golden child. He was loud, flashy, incredibly entitled, and entirely incompetent. Bradley had failed out of 2 different business schools and spent more time buying imported sports cars and taking lavish vacations than he ever did working a real job. Yet my father worshipped the ground he walked on simply because he was the male heir. As I sat near the far end of the long dining table nursing a simple glass of sparkling water, I watched my family gorge themselves on a celebration built entirely on my grandfather's grave. Bradley was already talking loudly to a captive audience of executives about his grand plans for the company. I listened quietly as my brother bragged about how he was going to fire the veteran operations managers, sell off the older warehouses, and pivot the company funds into tech startups and luxury yachts. It was repulsive. He was planning to dismantle decades of my grandfather's hard work just to fund his playboy lifestyle, and my father was sitting right next to him, nodding in absolute approval. The climax of the evening arrived just as the waiters began clearing the dessert plates. My father stood up, taking his crystal champagne flute and tapping it loudly with a heavy silver spoon. The room immediately fell silent, all eyes turning to the patriarch. My father puffed out his chest, his face flushed with wine and immense pride. He delivered a long self-congratulatory speech about legacy, about destiny, and about how he was finally ready to take the family corporation out of the dark ages and into a new era of unprecedented wealth. Then he turned his gaze to Bradley. He placed a heavy hand on my brother's shoulder and officially proclaimed him the new chief executive officer of the entire corporation. The room erupted into enthusiastic applause. The executives at the table clapped loudly, offering immediate congratulations to the new boss, eager to secure their own positions in the new regime. I simply maintained a neutral, emotionless expression, keeping my hands folded in my lap. As the applause died down, the head waiter approached my father carrying a thick black leather folder containing the dinner check. My father opened it and glanced at the final total. A cruel, calculated smirk slowly spread across his aging face. He looked down the length of the table, his eyes locking directly onto mine with absolute malice. Without missing a beat, he placed his hand flat on the leather folder and slid it hard across the polished mahogany wood. The folder glided smoothly past the half-empty wine glasses and dessert plates, stopping right in front of my hands. I looked down at the receipt protruding from the leather pocket. The final bill was exactly $15,000. The entire dining room went dead silent. The nervous laughter faded, and the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they were witnessing a public execution. My father leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the table, making sure his voice was loud enough for every single person in the room to hear. "Pay up, daughter," he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Consider it your contribution to the family you have disappointed for so long. You will not get a single cent of this estate anyway. Your brother is the true heir, and you are nothing but an employee." Bradley let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. The humiliation was designed to break me, to force me to beg or cry in front of his wealthy friends. But I did not cry. I did not beg. I simply looked at the $15,000 bill, my face an unreadable mask, fully aware that the balance of power in this family was about to shift in a way my father could never possibly imagine. The silence stretching across the dining room was broken by the sharp acrylic click of perfectly manicured fingernails tapping against a crystal wine glass. Jasmine leaned forward, ensuring the chandelier light caught the massive diamonds on her tennis bracelet. At 28 years old, my brother's African-American wife possessed striking beauty and an incredibly toxic, desperate need for superiority. She hailed from a family of prominent local politicians whose influence and bank accounts had dried up long ago. She had married Bradley strictly for his trust fund, and she spent every waking second overcompensating to prove she belonged among the city's ultra-wealthy elite. "Oh, Richard, do not be so hard on her," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with artificial saccharine sympathy. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "We all know a pathetic mid-level analyst's salary barely covers rent in downtown Chicago, let alone a celebration of this magnitude." Bradley chuckled, wrapping a possessive arm around his wife's shoulders. The executive sitting nearby offered polite, sycophantic laughs, eager to please the new CEO's wife. Jasmine smiled, emboldened by her audience. "Tell you what, Sydney, Bradley and I are closing on a stunning new summer house in the Hamptons next week. The contractors are leaving a massive mess behind. If you want, I can let you come scrub the hardwood floors and polish the baseboards for us. We can deduct a few $100s from your tab each weekend. It will build character, and you might actually learn the value of hard work." The table erupted into roaring, forced laughter. My father beamed from the head of the table, thrilled that his daughter-in-law was so eager to participate in my public execution. They all sat back, sipping their expensive bourbon, waiting for me to flush red with embarrassment to grab my purse and run out of the restaurant in tears. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Jasmine. I simply reached into my understated leather clutch. "I appreciate the generous offer, Jasmine," I said, my voice smooth, steady, and as cold as a sheet of ice, "but I prefer to handle my own debts immediately." I pulled out a card and tossed it onto the leather folio. It did not make the flimsy plastic snapping sound of a standard debit card. The heavy matte black titanium hit the solid mahogany table with a distinct authoritative thud. It was an American Express Centurion card, an invite-only piece of metal that required an initiation fee of $10,000 and millions in annual spending just to qualify for ownership. The head waiter, a seasoned professional accustomed to serving billionaires, instantly recognized the heavy black card. His eyes widened respectfully as he picked it up, bowing his head slightly, before turning toward the payment terminal. The laughter around the table died a sudden, choking death. Several of the senior financial executives stopped breathing, their eyes glued to the black card in the waiter's hand. These men worked in high finance. They knew exactly what that piece of titanium implied. You did not get a Centurion card on a mid-level analyst salary. You did not get one by accident. My father frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in aggressive confusion. He opened his mouth, likely to demand where I had gotten a fake credit card, assuming I was pulling a desperate, pathetic stunt to save face. Before he could utter a single insult, the waiter returned. He handed the receipt and a silver pen back to me with a deep, reverent bow. The transaction had gone through without a single hesitation. I signed my name with fluid, elegant strokes, added a generous $3,000 tip for the staff, and handed the folio back. The power dynamic in the room inverted so violently, it practically sucked the air out of the room. I tucked my clutch away and turned my undivided attention back to my sister-in-law. Jasmine looked uneasy, her eyes darting rapidly between the retreating waiter and my face. Her highly tuned social radar was blaring red warnings, but her arrogance kept her firmly anchored to her chair. I rested my chin on my hands, studying her outfit with clinical surgical precision. She was wearing an emerald green silk gown, clearly chosen to project the image of an untouchable generational corporate wife. "You know Jasmine," I said quietly, pitching my voice so the entire table had to lean in to hear me. "I have always admired your commitment to sustainability. Most women in your position would demand custom couture for an event honoring their husband's promotion." Jasmine sat up straighter, adjusting her posture and forcing a smug, defensive smile. "It is a vintage archive piece, Sydney. Not that someone with your pedestrian tastes would understand high fashion." I offered her a soft, pitying smile. "Oh, I understand it perfectly. I also understand how the inventory tracking system works at Luxe Wardrobe Rentals. It is a brilliant, highly discreet service for women trying to maintain wealthy appearances on a suffocatingly tight budget." Jasmine stopped breathing. "They do an excellent job with their dry cleaning," I continued mercilessly. "But you really should check the inner left seam before wearing their items to a private dinner. They missed a barcode." The blood drained entirely from Jasmine's beautiful face, leaving her looking physically ill. Her hand instinctively flew to her left hip, gripping the fabric. "I noticed the scan tag when you stood up to toast Bradley earlier." I added, my tone laced with devastating faux sympathy. "A spring collection dress from 3 years ago, rented for the weekend. Very resourceful of you." Jasmine's fragile, carefully constructed ego shattered in a fraction of a second. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she frantically attempted to hide the hidden fabric tag from the wealthy executive sitting directly next to her. The men who just moments ago had been laughing at her cruel jokes now looked extremely uncomfortable. A few of their wives exchanged highly amused, knowing glances. In the brutal, unforgiving world of Chicago high society, wearing a rented dress and getting caught was the ultimate, inescapable humiliation. Bradley looked wildly confused, staring at his wife's dress and then glaring angrily at me. "Shut your mouth, Sydney. Jasmine does not rent her clothes." "Of course she does, Bradley," I replied, my voice commanding the entire room. "Just like her political family ran out of campaign funds 2 years ago, forcing her to marry a gullible heir to save her social standing. We all make sacrifices to survive in this city. Yours is paying the dinner bill, hers is wearing recycled silk." Jasmine looked like she might burst into hysterical tears or throw her wineglass across the room. Her jaw tightened and she sank back into her plush leather chair, thoroughly defeated and utterly humiliated in front of the exact people she had tried to impress. My father's face turned a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. The veins in his neck pulsed violently against his starched white collar. He had orchestrated this entire dinner to publicly crush me, to put the useless daughter in her place. Instead, he had just watched me effortlessly drop $15,000 and psychologically dismantle his golden child's wife in under 2 minutes. "You ungrateful little wretch!" My father hissed, his voice vibrating with a dark and barely contained fury. He slammed both of his hands flat against the mahogany table, causing the crystal wineglasses to rattle violently. The remaining executives who had been enjoying the show just moments prior now shrank back into their high-backed leather chairs, desperate to avoid the crossfire. They were men who understood that corporate bloodbaths were messy, and they wanted absolutely no part in this one. Bradley jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Who the hell do you think you are, Sydney? You come into my celebration, insult my wife, and try to act like you are someone important. You are nothing but a glorified spreadsheet reader. You are a footnote in this family." I remained seated, resting my hands neatly on my lap, my expression completely unchanged. Their rage was predictable. They were men who had never built anything of their own, men who relied entirely on intimidation and unearned authority to mask their utter incompetence. When intimidation failed, they always resorted to threats. "You think flashing a fancy credit card makes you untouchable?" My father growled, leaning heavily over the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You think you can disrespect my son and his wife in my presence and simply walk away? I am the sole heir to Theodore's empire. I control every single asset, every bank account, every subsidiary, and every piece of real estate in this family." He stood up straight, adjusting his suit jacket, a cruel and triumphant glint returning to his eyes. He thought he had found my weak point. He thought he possessed the ultimate leverage to crush my sudden display of financial independence. "That includes the luxury high-rise building where you currently reside," he announced, his voice booming across the silent dining room so every executive could hear his decree. "You live in a downtown penthouse managed by our commercial real estate division. You have lived there subsidized for the past 5 years because I allowed it, because I tolerated your pathetic existence out of the goodness of my heart. But that ends tonight." Jasmine, still recovering from her brutal humiliation, managed a weak, vindictive smile. Bradley crossed his arms, looking immensely satisfied as his father delivered the final blow. "You have until Monday morning to pack your bags and vacate the premises," my father declared, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "I am officially evicting you. I am cutting off your access to the building. I will have security throw your belongings onto the street if you are not gone by 8 in the morning. You want to act like a big shot, Sydney. Let us see how far that black credit card goes when you are homeless and locked out of the family trust forever. You are dead to me. Get out of my sight." I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I just sat there staring back at the man who had despised me since the day I was born, perfectly content to let him continue digging his own grave. I knew something he did not. I knew the exact legal structure of the building I lived in, and I knew that his eviction threat was entirely baseless. But before I could deliver that particular piece of crushing reality, the heavy double oak doors of the private dining room swung open with a resounding thud. Every head in the room snapped toward the entrance. My father's face contorted in fresh outrage at the interruption. He had rented out the entire floor of the restaurant to ensure absolute privacy for his coronation. Stepping through the doorway was a man who instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. He was 65 years old, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit, holding a polished silver-handled cane that he used more for authority than actual support. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his piercing gray eyes swept across the room with the lethal, calculating precision of a seasoned predator. It was Mr. Kensington. For nearly 40 years, Mr. Kensington had been my grandfather, Theodore's private attorney, his chief legal strategist, and his most fiercely loyal confidant. He was a notoriously ruthless legal mastermind, a man who had personally destroyed corporate rivals and orchestrated hostile takeovers that made front-page financial news. The executives sitting at our table immediately stiffened in their chairs, recognizing the man who had essentially served as the silent co-founder of my grandfather's massive empire. My father's arrogant posture faltered for a fraction of a second before he puffed his chest back out. "Kensington," my father barked, gesturing aggressively toward the exit. "This is a private family celebration. We are conducting internal business. I did not invite you, and I certainly did not authorize your presence here. I am the sole owner of the estate now. Leave immediately." Mr. Kensington did not even acknowledge my father's existence. He did not glance at Bradley, who was staring at the formidable attorney with wide, nervous eyes. He completely ignored Jasmine, who was shrinking back into her seat. The older man simply adjusted his grip on his cane and walked with slow, deliberate, echoing steps across the hardwood floor. He bypassed the furious patriarch at the head of the table. He moved past the stunned financial executives. He did not stop until he reached the far end of the table, coming to a halt directly beside my chair. The silence in the dining room was absolute, heavy with unbearable tension. My father watched, his face twisting in confusion and mounting panic, unable to comprehend why his father's most trusted advisor was ignoring the new king to stand beside the discarded daughter. Mr. Kensington reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He produced a thick, heavy envelope made of premium parchment. The back of the envelope was sealed with dark crimson wax, stamped with my grandfather's personal crest. It was a seal my grandfather only used for his most highly classified, sensitive directives. The attorney held the heavy envelope out to me. I reached up and took it, feeling the weight of the thick documents hidden inside. Mr. Kensington leaned down slightly. His sharp gray eyes met mine, filled with a deep, unwavering respect that he had never once shown to my father or my brother. He lowered his voice, speaking just loud enough for me to hear over the dead silence of the room. "It is time to tell them who you really are." I held the heavy parchment envelope in my hands. The crimson wax seal felt cool against my skin. Mr. Kensington stood completely straight, gave me one final respectful nod, and turned toward the exit. He did not look back at my father. He did not need to. My father was completely paralyzed. His mouth hung slightly open, his face an apoplectic mask of confusion and unadulterated rage. Bradley looked like a frightened child who had just realized the monsters lurking in the dark were entirely real. Jasmine was staring at the floor, the remnants of her shattered ego keeping her firmly silenced. I did not owe them a dramatic speech. I did not owe them a single word of explanation. Silence was a far more lethal weapon, and I wielded it with absolute precision. I slipped the envelope into my leather clutch, stood up from the dining table, and walked out of the private room. I let the heavy oak door shut firmly behind me, instantly cutting off whatever panicked screaming inevitably erupted seconds later. The valet brought my car around to the front entrance of the Sovereign. It was an understated charcoal gray sedan, a highly deliberate choice to blend into the city traffic and maintain my cover as a mid-level corporate employee. I tipped the valet, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The vibrant city lights of downtown Chicago blurred against the rain-streaked windshield. The quiet isolation of the car cabin was exactly what I needed. I placed my clutch on the passenger seat and pulled out the envelope. I ran my thumb over my grandfather's crest, pressed deeply into the wax. Theodore was a man who planned for every possible contingency, a ruthless chess master who saw 10 moves ahead of his most seasoned opponents. Breaking the seal, I tipped the contents into the palm of my hand. 2 objects slid out. The first was a heavy, intricately milled brass safety deposit key. It bore the distinct numeric engravings of a high-security private vault, the kind used in elite private depositories reserved for the ultra-wealthy, right here in the financial district. The second object was a sleek, matte black flash drive with a biometric thumbprint scanner built directly into the casing. I reached into my center console and pulled out my personal laptop. I booted up the machine and inserted the flash drive. A solid red light pulsed on the side of the device. I pressed my right thumb against the scanner. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then the light turned a solid, reassuring green. The drive decrypted instantly, and a massive directory of highly classified legal files flooded my screen. I opened the master summary document titled with a single word: Directive. It was a formal letter addressed directly to me, written in my grandfather's sharp, uncompromising legal tone. As I read the opening paragraph, a cold and triumphant smile slowly spread across my face. Theodore knew exactly what my father was. He knew Richard was a vain, arrogant fool who cared significantly more about country club status and high society perception than actual profit margins. He knew Bradley was a lazy, entitled liability who would bankrupt the entire family legacy within a decade if given the keys to the kingdom. My grandfather was never going to let his life's work be dismantled and destroyed by the very men who bore his last name. Over the last 5 years, while my father was busy bragging at charity galas and Bradley was crashing imported sports cars, Theodore had executed the most brilliant, ruthless corporate restructuring in Chicago history. He had systematically and legally gutted his own empire from the inside out. According to the ledgers displaying on my screen, my grandfather had initiated a complex series of asset transfers, silent divestments, and blind trust allocations. He had stripped the primary family corporation of 80% of its core highly profitable assets. The prime commercial real estate dominating downtown Chicago, the massive logistics hubs spread across the Midwest, the lucrative international shipping contracts, and the untouchable offshore cash reserves were all completely gone. He had transferred them out of the main company and quietly shifted them into a stealth corporate entity. I clicked on the current balance sheets for the original corporation, the exact company my father had just inherited by default because Theodore deliberately chose not to leave a last will and testament. The sheer genius of the trap left me breathless. On the surface, the company still looked like a multi-billion-dollar juggernaut. It had the famous family name on the building, the massive corporate headquarters, and the thousands of daily employees. But functionally, it was an entirely hollow shell. Theodore had restructured the accounting books so that the original company retained all the massive liabilities, the toxic underperforming assets, and the staggering operational overhead. Worse than that, my grandfather had orchestrated a series of massive internal loans just before his death. The company Richard was currently celebrating owning was actually drowning in crippling debt. It was bleeding cash on a daily basis, and that massive debt was owed entirely to the stealth entity that now held all the real power and all the real money. I leaned back against the leather headrest, staring at the glowing screen illuminating the dark car. My father genuinely thought he had won the ultimate prize. He thought the state intestacy laws had handed him absolute unquestioned control over the family fortune. He was currently sitting in a private dining room drinking outrageously expensive champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just inherited a rapidly sinking ship. He was the proud new king of an empire built entirely on quicksand. But the most crucial piece of information remained. I needed to see the identity of the stealth entity holding the true wealth. I clicked on the articles of incorporation for the shadow company to see who Theodore had placed in charge of the real empire. As the legal paperwork loaded, the name of the holding company appeared on the screen, followed by the identity of its sole founder and majority shareholder. My pulse quickened as the final piece of the puzzle locked into place. The trap was perfectly set, and my father had just gleefully walked right into it. The name staring back at me from the glowing screen was Apex Holdings. It was a sterile, unassuming corporate designation, exactly the kind of invisible entity that controlled massive swaths of the global economy without ever making a headline. I clicked on the Master Operating Agreement, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted legal jargon until I reached the executive structuring section. Theodore had not just established a trust fund for me, he had built an impenetrable fortress, and he had handed me the only key. My full legal name was listed on the primary documentation. I was not designated as a mere beneficiary or a silent partner. My grandfather had explicitly named me as the sole founder, the absolute majority shareholder, and the sitting chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I sat in the quiet isolation of my car, listening to the rain tap against the roof, letting the staggering reality of my new existence wash over me. The mid-level analyst persona I had maintained for the past 5 years was nothing but an elaborate, brilliantly constructed disguise. My father and brother had spent every day treating me like a disposable employee, completely unaware that they were mocking the woman who now owned the concrete beneath their feet. I opened the secondary folder on the encrypted drive, navigating straight to the debt ledgers. I needed to see exactly how Theodore had weaponized the financial structure. The numbers populating the spreadsheet were breathtaking. Over the past 5 years, my grandfather had deliberately starved the original family corporation of its liquid cash. To keep the lights on and fund the extravagant executive bonuses, my father demanded the original company had to borrow money. They took out massive high-interest internal loans, and the entity providing that cash lifeline was Apex Holdings. According to the contract signed and ratified by my grandfather before his death, the corporate shell my father just inherited currently owed Apex Holdings exactly $500 million. A cold, predatory thrill coursed through my veins as I read the loan covenants. Mr. Kensington had drafted these financial instruments with lethal precision. The terms were absolutely draconian. The debt was secured against every remaining tangible asset the original company possessed, including the iconic downtown Chicago headquarters. There were no grace periods. There were no renegotiation clauses. If the original corporation missed a single scheduled payment, Apex Holdings possessed the legal right to accelerate the debt. That meant I could demand the entire $500 million balance immediately. I scrolled down to the signature pages of the loan agreements. Theodore had known that Richard never bothered to read the fine print on anything longer than 2 pages. My father relied entirely on summaries and his own misplaced confidence. Several years ago, during a routine board meeting, Theodore had slipped these debt agreements into a stack of standard corporate resolutions. My father had signed them blindly. Worse than that, he had signed a personal guarantee. My father had legally bound his own private assets, his mansions, his luxury cars, and his personal bank accounts to the massive debt. If the company defaulted, I had the legal authority to wipe him out entirely. The brilliance of my grandfather's strategy was absolute. He had recognized my potential years ago during our private late-night discussions about market trends and asset management. He saw that I possessed his cold, analytical mind. He also saw that my father was a vain, reckless fool who would inevitably destroy the family legacy. Theodore had essentially rigged the entire empire with financial explosives and handed me the detonator. I opened the banking portal linked to the encrypted drive. The balance staring back at me from the offshore accounts was staggering. The sheer liquidity Theodore had stockpiled within Apex Holdings made me instantly one of the wealthiest individuals in the city. Yet staring at those 9-figure balances, I felt no urge to celebrate. Money, as my grandfather taught me, was merely a tool. Power was the actual currency that mattered. My father had spent his entire life chasing the appearance of wealth, completely misunderstanding how actual power operated in the shadows. I unplugged the encrypted flash drive from my laptop and held the small piece of metal in my palm. This tiny device contained more power than the entire executive board sitting in that private dining room. I thought about Jasmine and her rented silk dress mocking my salary. I thought about Bradley loudly planning to dismantle the company logistics division to fund his playboy lifestyle. I thought about my father sliding that $15,000 dinner bill across the table and threatening to leave me homeless. They were all dancing on the edge of a cliff, completely blind to the drop. I tucked the flash drive safely into the hidden zippered compartment of my clutch alongside the brass safety deposit key. I started the engine of my understated sedan and pulled out of the valet lane, merging smoothly into the slick, rain-soaked traffic of downtown Chicago. I drove back to my modest apartment, the one my father proudly claimed he was subsidizing out of pity. He genuinely believed he had the power to evict me by Monday morning. He had no idea that I had quietly purchased the entire residential building through a proxy LLC 2 years ago, using my early dividends from Apex Holdings. I was his landlord. Tomorrow morning, the corporate world would officially recognize Bradley as the new chief executive officer of the family business. My brother would undoubtedly swagger into the downtown headquarters, eager to assert his dominance over the staff. He would immediately look for targets to bully, and I was always his favorite punching bag. He would summon me to his pristine new office, entirely confident in his unearned authority, ready to flex his power and put his discarded sister in her place. I smiled as I parked my car in the secure underground garage. I was looking forward to tomorrow. I would walk into that corporate high-rise exactly as I always did. I would wear my standard, unassuming business attire. I would carry my cheap coffee cup and sit at my small, unremarkable desk in the data division. I would let them bark their orders and parade their false superiority. I would let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly could. They thought they were dealing with a frightened, helpless subordinate. They had no idea they were about to step into the cage with the apex predator. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters was heavy and suffocating. I walked through the towering glass doors at exactly 8 o'clock, holding my generic paper coffee cup and wearing my standard tailored gray suit. I moved through the bustling lobby like a ghost, exactly as I had done for the past 5 years. The security guards nodded politely, and the administrative staff barely glanced my way. I took the elevator up to the data division, sat at my unassuming desk, and booted up my computer. To the rest of the world, I was just another corporate drone settling in for a long day of spreadsheets. I knew the reality was far more entertaining. Bradley did not arrive until 10:30. He strolled through the main lobby wearing a custom Italian suit that cost more than most of our administrative staff earned in a year. His African-American wife, Jasmine, was walking right beside him, clinging to his arm as if she were the first lady of the corporation. Her presence was entirely inappropriate for a corporate workday, but Bradley loved parading her around to project an image of untouchable modern royalty. They bypassed the standard security checkpoints and marched directly into the private executive elevator. I watched the floor numbers tick upward on the digital display, knowing exactly what kind of chaos was about to unfold on the top level. His first order of business was to establish absolute dominance. Bradley immediately summoned the senior management team to the glass-walled boardroom. 30 minutes later, two of my grandfather's most loyal and brilliant operations directors walked out carrying cardboard boxes. Bradley was firing the only people who actually understood the logistics network. He was terminating decades of industry experience simply to prove that the old guard was dead, and he was the unquestioned authority. It was a monumental strategic blunder. The shell company he had just inherited was already hemorrhaging cash, and he had just severed its operational arteries. I watched the veteran directors leave the building knowing their departure would accelerate Bradley's inevitable ruin. By noon, my desk phone buzzed sharply. It was Bradley's newly appointed executive assistant, a young woman who sounded completely terrified. She informed me that the chief executive officer required my presence in his suite immediately. I picked up my blank notepad, smoothed my jacket, and calmly walked to the elevator. The executive suite had already been completely desecrated. My grandfather's understated functional antique furniture had been shoved into the hallway, replaced by gaudy modern art and ridiculous velvet seating that looked like it belonged in a nightclub. Bradley was sitting behind a massive glass desk, leaning back with his feet kicked up on the pristine surface, scrolling through his phone. Jasmine was lounging on a nearby sofa, flipping through a fashion magazine while sipping sparkling water. Bradley did not bother to look up when I entered. He let me stand in the center of the room for a full minute playing a pathetic power game. "You asked to see me, Bradley," I said, maintaining my perfectly neutral analyst persona. He dropped his feet to the floor and leaned forward, trying to look intimidating. He failed miserably. "That is Mr. Chief Executive Officer while you are in this building," he snapped. Jasmine chuckled softly from the sofa, clearly enjoying the display of authority. "Let us get straight to business," Bradley continued, ignoring my silence. "I have been reviewing the corporate accounts this morning. Dad and I have massive expansion plans. We are modernizing this archaic dinosaur of a company. However, aggressive expansion requires immediate aggressive liquidity." I knew exactly what he was actually saying. He had opened the financial ledgers. He had seen the empty bank accounts. He had seen the massive debt obligations owed to Apex Holdings and the staggering operational costs draining the company dry. Panic was already setting in, though his arrogance would never allow him to admit it to anyone, especially me. "I am restructuring our internal capital," Bradley announced, sliding a thick legal document across the glass desk. Grandma left a small trust fund when she died. It was supposed to be a sentimental rainy day fund for the grandchildren. Since I am now running the family empire, I am consolidating all rogue assets. I need you to sign your portion over to the corporate treasury today. I looked down at the document. The trust fund was relatively small, a few $100,000 at most, but it was the only asset our grandmother had specifically protected from my father's greedy hands. It held immense sentimental value. Demanding I sign it over to cover his catastrophic cash flow problems was the ultimate insult. They were attempting to rob my history to fund their delusions. That trust is strictly personal, Bradley, I said, keeping my voice even and calm. It has absolutely nothing to do with corporate liquidity. Bradley slammed his fist on the desk. It does when I say it does. You live off the salary this company provides. You live in a building my real estate division owns. You owe this family your absolute loyalty, and right now, loyalty means injecting cash into my expansion strategy. Sign the paper, Sydney. Jasmine stood up from the sofa, walking over to stand behind Bradley. She placed her hands on his shoulders, staring at me with a condescending, predatory glare. Do not be so selfish, Sydney. Bradley is carrying the weight of an entire empire on his shoulders. The least you can do is contribute that pathetic little savings account to help him secure the family legacy. It is not like you have a husband or children to spend it on anyway. I looked at her, then back at Bradley. The sheer desperation radiating from them was almost intoxicating. They were drowning, completely unaware that the ocean they were sinking in belonged entirely to me. I am not signing over my grandmother's trust fund to finance your ego, Bradley. I stated clearly, letting a trace of steel enter my voice. If the company is already facing liquidity issues on your very first day as CEO, perhaps you should not have fired the only two directors who knew how to generate actual revenue. Bradley's face flushed a volatile, furious red. The truth hit him entirely too hard. You insolent little data cruncher! You do not tell me how to run my company. He grabbed a silver pen and shoved it toward me, the document sliding dangerously close to the edge of the glass desk. You will sign this document right now, or I will make sure your life in this city is completely destroyed. I will fire you. I will blacklist you from every financial firm in Chicago. I will have you thrown out of your apartment by tonight. He was giving me exactly what I wanted. A documented, undeniable threat from the sitting CEO. I needed him to escalate. I needed him to push the boundaries of legality and sanity so that when I finally dropped the hammer, his destruction would be absolute. I looked at the pen, then looked directly into my brother's furious eyes, ready to push him right over the edge. I did not reach for the silver pen. Instead, I stood up from the velvet chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I looked down at the trust document, then back at Bradley's flushed, entitled face. If you are going to threaten an employee, Bradley, I highly suggest you consult corporate counsel first. As for my grandmother's trust fund, you will not touch a single cent of it. Try to learn how to read a balance sheet before you bankrupt this company entirely. I turned on my heel and walked out of the executive suite, leaving the glass door wide open. I could hear Bradley screaming obscenities behind me, the sound echoing down the pristine corporate hallway. Jasmine was shrieking something about respect and family loyalty, but I tuned them out entirely. I walked straight to the elevator, my expression an impenetrable mask. I knew my refusal would trigger a massive retaliation. In my family, insubordination was treated as high treason. My father and brother were cowards who fought their battles not in boardrooms, but in the vicious, gossipy circles of Chicago high society. By the time I reached my desk on the lower floors, the smear campaign had already begun. Richard was a master manipulator. He immediately started making calls to his wealthy associates, the country club board members, and the elite society matrons. The narrative they spun was entirely predictable, but incredibly damaging. They claimed I had suffered a severe mental breakdown because I was insanely jealous of Bradley's sudden promotion. They told anyone who would listen that I was completely broke, drowning in credit card debt, and had desperately tried to embezzle money from the corporate treasury to fund a secret, reckless lifestyle. According to my father's fabricated story, he and Bradley had caught me trying to forge signatures on family trust documents. They painted themselves as the benevolent, heartbroken patriarchs who were forced to cut ties with a deeply disturbed criminal daughter to protect the family legacy. It was a brilliant, malicious lie designed to isolate me and destroy any credibility I might have if I ever tried to speak out against them. The effects of their poison spread rapidly throughout the building. Within 48 hours, the atmosphere in the corporate headquarters became absolutely unbearable. Junior analysts who used to greet me by the coffee machine now averted their eyes and hurried past. The administrative staff whispered behind their hands when I walked into the break room. My corporate email access was abruptly restricted, and my security badge was deactivated for the upper executive floors. Bradley was flexing his pathetic muscles, trying to make my daily existence as miserable as possible. He wanted me to break down and beg for mercy. Even outside the office, the rumors took a vicious hold. My father had deliberately leaked his fictional story to the property management team at my residential building. The lobby concierge gave me strange, pitying looks, clearly having heard the gossip that I was about to be evicted for stealing from my own family. The valets whispered when I retrieved my car. It took an immense amount of self-control not to inform them that I actually owned the entire luxury high-rise and signed their paychecks. But I maintained my icy composure. I let them talk. I let my father and brother dig their graves deeper with every vicious lie they told. They were operating under the delusion that public opinion dictated reality. They did not understand that while they were busy managing their reputation at country club mixers, I was sitting at my desk, quietly reviewing the accelerated default clauses on the $500 million loan they owed my shadow company. Let them call me crazy. Let them call me broke. The louder they screamed their lies, the more devastating the truth would be when I finally dropped the guillotine. I was securing airtight legal documentation of their defamation, adding it to the mounting pile of evidence my legal team was preparing. Every slanderous phone call my father made was just another nail in his corporate coffin. Jasmine naturally saw my manufactured downfall as the perfect opportunity to elevate her own social standing. She thrived on tearing other women down, and with my father's official blessing to destroy me, she went entirely off the rails. She wanted to cement her position as the new queen of the corporate empire by publicly humiliating the disgraced unstable sister. She needed an audience to validate her unearned superiority. On Thursday morning, a heavy cream-colored envelope was dropped onto my desk by an intern who looked terrified to even approach me. Inside was an embossed invitation to an exclusive afternoon tea party hosted by Jasmine at the Drake Hotel. The guest list would undoubtedly include all the wealthy society wives my father had been poisoning with his lies. It was a blatant, malicious setup. Jasmine intended to parade me in front of Chicago's elite as the broken, destitute outcast of the family. She wanted to force me to serve tea to her friends, a public execution disguised as a high society gathering. I looked at the gold foil lettering on the invitation and smiled a cold, calculated smile. Jasmine wanted a show, and I was more than happy to give her one. I placed the invitation neatly next to my keyboard and opened a secure encrypted file on my computer. I had spent the last 2 days gathering highly sensitive financial documents regarding her family's political fundraising accounts. If Jasmine wanted to play games with reputations, I was ready to show her exactly how a real apex predator operates. The Palm Court at the Drake Hotel was a masterclass in gilded elegance. A live harpist played in the corner, the delicate plucking of strings weaving through the low hum of wealthy conversation, and the soft clink of sterling silver against fine bone china. It was the epicenter of Chicago high society, a place where reputations were built over cucumber sandwiches and destroyed over Earl Grey. I handed my coat to the attendant and stepped into the grand room, my posture flawless, my expression an unreadable mask. I had chosen my outfit with lethal precision. Unlike Jasmine, who relied on flashy logos and rented runway pieces to scream her status, I wore a custom-tailored navy blue blazer from an exclusive Italian house that did not advertise. It was stealth wealth, the kind of fabric that only those with actual generational money would recognize. The moment I crossed the threshold, the atmospheric shift was immediate. The whispers started before I even reached the center aisle. Wives of senators, hedge fund managers, and real estate moguls leaned into each other, their eyes darting toward me behind manicured hands. My father and brother had done their malicious work perfectly. I could practically hear the fabricated narrative bouncing from table to table. There goes the unstable sister, the one who went crazy and tried to steal from the family. The penniless dropout. I ignored them all. I kept my gaze fixed, dead ahead, moving with the measured predatory grace of someone who owned the very ground they walked on. Jasmine was holding court at the largest, most prominent table in the center of the room. She was surrounded by women whose husbands relied on my father for business contracts. She wore a bright crimson dress that desperately wanted to look expensive, her wrists weighed down by gaudy bracelets. When she spotted me navigating the maze of floral centerpieces, her face lit up with a brilliant predatory smile. It was the smile of a woman who believed she held all the cards and was about to execute the final humiliating blow. "Sydney," Jasmine called out, projecting her voice loudly enough to ensure the surrounding tables stopped their conversations to listen. "You actually came. We were all so worried about you." I stopped at the edge of her table. There were 6 women seated with her, all staring up at me with varying expressions of morbid curiosity and manufactured pity. I noticed immediately that there was no empty chair. Jasmine had intentionally invited me to an exclusive sit-down event without reserving a place for me. It was a classic vicious high society power play designed to make me look foolish and unwelcome. "Hello, Jasmine," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Thank you for the invitation." Jasmine pressed a hand to her chest, feigning deep maternal concern. "When Richard told us about your recent mental struggles and your tragic financial situation, I just knew I had to reach out. We all know how hard it must be for you living in that tiny subsidized apartment, struggling to make ends meet, while Bradley carries the entire corporate empire. I thought a nice civilized afternoon out of the office might lift your spirits." One of the older women at the table, the wife of a prominent corporate banker, offered me a condescending smile. "It is so brave of you to show your face, dear. Mental health is nothing to be ashamed of. We all hope you find the help you desperately need." My brother had trained his wife well. They were using feigned sympathy to publicly cement my status as the broken charity case relative. They wanted me to lash out, to yell, or to burst into tears, which would only validate their malicious rumors. I simply looked down at Jasmine. "I assure you, my mental health and my finances have never been more secure." Jasmine let out a sharp, theatrical sigh, shaking her head, as if dealing with a delusional child. "Denial is always the first stage, Sydney. Bradley warned me you might be combative. He is just so heartbroken over your betrayal. He really wanted to help you pay off your crushing credit card debt, but stealing from the corporate treasury was just a step too far." The women around the table gasped in unison. Jasmine had dropped the embezzlement rumor right in the middle of the palm court. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dozens of eyes were locked onto me, waiting for the humiliated sister to crack under the immense social pressure. "Oh dear," Jasmine said, looking around the table with fake dismay. "It seems we are completely out of chairs. I told the concierge to prepare a seat for you, but I suppose with your unpredictable behavior recently they must have assumed you would not show up. What a terrible oversight." She did not offer to have a waiter bring another chair. Instead, she leaned back and gestured lazily toward the heavy, ornate silver teapot sitting in the center of the table. "Since you are already standing, Sydney, why don't you make yourself useful?" Jasmine smiled, her eyes flashing with pure, venomous triumph. "My cup is empty. Be a dear and pour the tea for the table. We would hate for you to feel entirely useless today." The disrespect was breathtaking. She was not just excluding me from the table. She was explicitly commanding me to act as her personal servant in front of the most powerful women in Chicago. It was a calculated attempt to break my spirit, to force me into physical submission, to make me bow my head and pour her Earl Grey while she reveled in her unearned superiority. The harpist continued playing in the corner, but the surrounding tables had gone entirely still. The wives watched with bated breath. This was the moment they expected me to run away in tears, securing my permanent exile from their elite circles. I stood perfectly still, looking at the silver teapot, then back at Jasmine's gloating face. My fingers brushed against the smooth leather of the slim folder tucked neatly beneath my arm. The folder containing the explosive, verified financial documents regarding her family's illegal political fundraising accounts. I did not break eye contact as I stepped closer to the table. I reached out with a steady, unshakable hand and wrapped my fingers around the polished silver handle of the teapot. I lifted it effortlessly, leaning in toward Jasmine's empty porcelain cup. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for, right before I burned her entire fabricated kingdom to the ground. I held the heavy silver teapot steady. The steaming amber liquid flowed in a perfect unbroken stream into Jasmine's delicate porcelain cup. I did not spill a single drop. I did not look at the cup. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Jasmine. Her triumphant smile wavered just a fraction of an inch under my relentless gaze. She had expected my hands to shake. She had anticipated tears of degradation. She wanted the women at the table to witness my total submission. Instead, I poured the tea with the practiced elegance of a woman holding absolute power. I filled the cup precisely to the brim, set the silver teapot back onto its matching tray, and offered her a chillingly polite nod. "Enjoy your tea, Jasmine," I said softly. As I stepped back from the table, I subtly shifted my posture. The slim leather folder tucked securely beneath my arm slid downward. I opened my grip just enough to let gravity do the rest. The folder hit the edge of the table with a sharp smack. The magnetic clasp sprang open. Dozens of highly classified financial documents spilled directly across the pristine white tablecloth, landing right next to the tiered plates of cucumber sandwiches and macarons. The wives gasped, pulling their fine china teacups away to avoid the scattering papers. I made no immediate move to pick them up. I let the stark white pages rest in plain sight. The wife of the corporate banker, the exact same woman who had offered me fake pity just moments ago, looked down at the paper resting inches from her hand. Her eyes caught the bold red lettering at the top of the page. It was an official seal from the Internal Revenue Service, followed by a federal subpoena notice. "Oh, my deepest apologies," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent Palm Court. "I was just reviewing some urgent risk assessment files for the data division. As a mid-level analyst, I have to keep track of hazardous liabilities that might damage our corporate reputation." Jasmine reached out to shove the papers back toward me, but she froze when she saw her own maiden name printed in bold ink on the federal subpoena. The blood instantly drained from her face, leaving her completely ashen. "What is this?" the banker's wife asked, unable to mask her morbid curiosity. She leaned closer to read the text. "Just a standard federal audit," I replied casually, making sure my voice carried to the surrounding tables. "It seems Jasmine's political family has been redirecting campaign donations into offshore personal accounts. The IRS froze all their assets yesterday morning. They are currently under investigation for multi-million-dollar tax evasion. I suppose that explains why Bradley had to marry into the family so quickly. They needed our corporate treasury to pay their mounting legal fees." Jasmine shot up from her chair. Her face twisted into a mask of pure panic and rage. "That is a lie. You are making this up. You forged these documents because you are insanely jealous of my position in this family." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout. "I do not forge documents, Jasmine. The federal court docket number is printed right there at the bottom of the page. Anyone in this room with a smartphone can verify it in 10 seconds. It is a matter of public record as of this morning." Jasmine stumbled backward, her hand flying to the large, bright orange Hermes Birkin bag sitting proudly on the empty chair beside her. It was her ultimate status symbol, the accessory she used to assert dominance over the other wives. She clutched it to her chest like a life preserver, trying to shield herself with the illusion of immense wealth. "You are completely unhinged," Jasmine stammered, her voice shaking violently as she looked around at her friends for support. "Everyone knows you are crazy. Look at my lifestyle. Look at my bag. Do you really think a family facing federal tax evasion could afford a $40,000 exotic leather Birkin?" I smiled. It was the exact opening I had laid out for her. The trap was sprung. "I am so glad you brought up the bag, Jasmine. If you look at the second page of that spilled folder, you will find a certified authentication report." The other women at the table instantly leaned forward, their eyes darting from the documents to the orange bag clutched tightly in Jasmine's hands. "You see," I continued mercilessly, "when my brother used the corporate credit card to purchase that bag for your anniversary last month, my division flagged the transaction. The vendor was not Hermes. It was a third-party luxury reseller operating out of a suburban strip mall. I had an independent authenticator review the serial numbers and the hardware stitching from the photographs you so proudly posted online." Jasmine clutched the bag tighter, looking like a trapped animal. The aristocratic wives around her were listening to my every word with rapt attention. The stitching on the handles is machine-pressed, not hand-sewn, I stated, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. The gold plating on the lock contains traces of zinc which tarnishes, and the serial number blind stamped inside the interior strap actually belongs to a black leather wallet manufactured 7 years ago. Your ultimate status symbol is a counterfeit. The collective gasp from the elite society wives was deafening. In their insulated world, federal tax evasion was a scandalous topic for dinner parties. But carrying a fake Birkin bag to the Palm Court at the Drake Hotel was an unforgivable crime. It was the ultimate indicator of a fraud. It was total, instantaneous social death. The banker's wife physically recoiled from Jasmine pulling her chair back, as if proximity to a counterfeit bag might be contagious. The other women exchanged horrified, disgusted glances. They had spent the last hour treating Jasmine like a queen, letting her dictate the social hierarchy, and now they realized she was an imposter drowning in legal trouble and wearing cheap knockoffs. "You are lying," Jasmine shrieked, losing every ounce of her carefully cultivated high society poise, her voice cracked loud and desperate. "You are just a jealous, broke, pathetic loser." I reached out and calmly gathered my documents from the pristine table, tapping them neatly into a crisp stack. I looked at the women seated around the table, then finally rested my gaze on my completely ruined sister-in-law. "I may be a mid-level analyst, Jasmine, but at least I own my clothes, and my family is not facing federal prison time." I tucked the folder back under my arm, offered the horrified society wives a polite nod, and turned my back on my brother's wife. I walked out of the Palm Court with the same predatory grace I had entered with, leaving Jasmine completely isolated. She stood in the center of the room clutching a fake plastic bag, while Chicago's elite watched her fabricated kingdom collapse into dust. The fallout from that afternoon was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic for my brother. By the time I returned to my unassuming desk at the corporate headquarters, the vicious gossip had already saturated the upper executive floors. Jasmine had fled the luxury hotel in hysterical tears, calling Bradley in a frantic panic. She demanded he do something massive to restore their public image and crush the rumors I had ignited. She was completely oblivious to the fact that their private reality was already bankrupt. Bradley, driven entirely by his fragile ego and his desperate need to be perceived as a titan of industry, decided the only way to silence the high society whispers was to make a spectacle of wealth so undeniable it would blind everyone to the truth. He needed to prove he was a visionary. He needed to prove my grandfather made the right choice by making him the sole heir. He had absolutely no idea how corporate finance actually worked. Sitting at my terminal in the data division, I pulled up the restricted executive ledger. My grandfather had built backdoor monitoring protocols into the company's financial software years ago, giving Apex Holdings real-time access to every single transaction. I watched in cold fascination as Bradley authorized a fatal purchase. He bought a 200-foot custom mega yacht currently docked in Monaco. It was an $80 million floating palace, equipped with a helipad, a submarine bay, and a glass-bottom pool. He did not use personal funds because he had none. He authorized a massive corporate line of credit, leveraging the company's rapidly dwindling operational accounts to secure the vessel. He classified it as a corporate entertainment expense for elite international client acquisitions. It was a textbook display of financial suicide. The down payment alone drained 70% of the remaining liquid cash in the corporate treasury. I watched the numbers on my screen plummet, astounded by how quickly arrogance could vaporize decades of my grandfather's hard work. But Bradley did not stop there. The massive yacht purchase triggered immediate glaring liquidity warnings across the accounting department. The chief financial officer, one of the few seasoned veterans Bradley had not yet managed to fire, rushed into the executive suite, begging him to reverse the transaction before it was finalized. Instead of listening to reason, my brother doubled down on his delusion. He sought a miraculous overnight return on investment to cover the gaping hole he had just blasted into the corporate accounts. He wanted to look like a modern tech genius. Through the shadow ledger, I watched him wire the final 30% of the company's operational cash into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. It was a notoriously volatile platform, aggressively marketed by internet influencers, promising guaranteed triple-digit returns within days. To any competent financial analyst, it was a blatant, neon-lit Ponzi scheme. Bradley essentially took the employee payroll, the vendor budgets, and the utility funds for a multi-billion-dollar corporate facade and pushed them all onto red at a digital roulette table. He genuinely believed he was outsmarting the market. He thought he would double the company's cash reserves over the weekend, pay off the yacht, and silence his critics forever. He was playing Monopoly with monopoly money, completely unaware that the board was owned by Apex Holdings. The collapse happened faster than even my most conservative projections had anticipated. By Friday morning, the offshore crypto exchange abruptly halted all global withdrawals. The platform founders vanished into the ether, taking every last cent of my brother's desperate, reckless investment with them. The corporate treasury hit absolute zero. The reality of a hollow empire finally caught up with the physical world. At exactly noon, the automated payroll system attempted to distribute weekly wages to our 3,000 employees across the Midwest. The system crashed hard. Red error messages flooded my monitor in a beautiful cascading wave. Payroll bounced. The primary vendor accounts began freezing immediately. The automated payments for the downtown high-rise utilities were rejected for insufficient funds by our primary banking partners. A wave of confusion swept through the open plan office as employees began checking their bank apps on their phones. Murmurs turned into anxious conversations. Mid-level managers started dialing the accounting department only to find the lines continually busy. The polished facade of the corporate giant was cracking in real time. Up in the penthouse executive suite, absolute panic set in. Even through the soundproofed walls, I could hear the muffled, frantic shouting echoing down the ventilation shafts. Richard had rushed into the building after receiving an urgent call from the banking division. I could hear my father screaming at Bradley, the sharp, distinct sound of heavy objects being thrown and glass shattering against the walls. My father had handed the keys to the kingdom to a fool, and the fool had driven the car straight off a cliff in less than 5 days. The company was functionally dead. They had no cash, no assets to liquidate, and an angry mob of employees who were about to realize their paychecks were made of empty promises. I sat at my desk, quietly sipping my lukewarm coffee, watching the chaos unfold around me with total serenity. I closed the restricted ledger on my monitor and opened a fresh blank spreadsheet. They were cornered, humiliated, and utterly broke. I knew exactly what a desperate man like my father would do next, and I was waiting patiently for his final fatal mistake. My father's final fatal mistake began exactly 2 hours after the payroll system crashed. The absolute panic radiating from the penthouse suite was palpable even on the lower floors. Richard was a man entirely obsessed with public perception. To him, bankruptcy was not a financial issue. It was a mortal social sin. If word leaked to the Chicago financial press that his company could not even cover employee wages on his son's first week as chief executive officer, his reputation would be permanently incinerated. He could not walk into a traditional bank. Any major financial institution like Chase or Goldman Sachs would demand a comprehensive forensic audit of the corporate books before authorizing a massive commercial loan. An audit would immediately expose the missing operational funds, the catastrophic mega yacht purchase, and the humiliating offshore crypto scam Bradley had just fallen for. My father needed cash instantly, quietly, and without a single question asked. He needed a shadow lender. He needed hard money. My encrypted personal cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I stepped away from my desk, walking calmly into a vacant conference room on the data floor, and locked the glass door behind me. It was Mr. Kensington. His voice was smooth-cultured and laced with dark amusement. "Your father has just contacted a high-risk commercial broker in the financial district," the seasoned attorney reported. "He is frantically seeking a $50 million bridge loan to cover the payroll deficit and stabilize the vendor accounts. He is offering the downtown corporate headquarters building as collateral." The broker immediately reached out to our firm, knowing we represent immense private liquidity. They are asking if Apex Holdings would be interested in underwriting the debt. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face. The corporate headquarters was a towering skyscraper of glass and steel, right in the heart of the Chicago Loop. It was the crown jewel of my grandfather's public-facing empire. My father was so desperately trying to hide Bradley's staggering incompetence that he was willing to mortgage the very building he was standing in. Accept the proposal. I instructed my attorney, my voice entirely devoid of mercy. But we dictate the terms. He wants $50 million by the end of the business day to save his public image. Give it to him. Set the interest rate at a predatory 25%. Make it a demand loan with a strict 30-day maturation window. And insert a universal cross-default clause. Brutal, Mr. Kensington noted, sounding immensely proud. If he misses a single payment, or if any other corporate debt goes into default, we can accelerate the loan and seize the skyscraper immediately. I will draft the paperwork. Wait, I added, staring out the conference room window at the sprawling Chicago skyline. Add one more stipulation. The building is not enough. I want a personal guarantee. He has to sign away his private wealth, his mansion in the suburbs, his luxury cars, his personal investment portfolios, everything. If he wants the $50 million to cover up his son's disaster, he has to put his own neck in the noose. He will never read the fine print, Mr. Kensington replied. He is too desperate to keep the employees from rioting. I will send the contracts to his broker immediately. I ended the call and walked back to my desk. The sheer irony of the situation was intoxicating. My father was running around the executive suite screaming at his lawyers and brokers, desperately begging for a financial lifeline. He had absolutely no idea that the mysterious, incredibly wealthy offshore entity throwing him a rope was the very same daughter he had verbally disowned and threatened to leave homeless just 24 hours ago. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my computer monitor illuminated with a secure notification from Mr. Kensington. He forwarded me the digital copies of the executed loan agreements. I opened the PDF file and zoomed in on the final page. There it was. My father's unmistakable aggressive signature scrawled across the dotted line. He had signed the corporate collateral agreement handing over the legal rights to the skyscraper. Right below that, he had signed the personal guarantee. He had legally bound his own private assets to the debt. He had traded his entire personal fortune for a $50 million Band-Aid to cover up a fatal arterial bleed. The money was wired from the Apex Holdings offshore accounts directly into the corporate treasury at 4:45. 15 minutes later, the automated payroll system rebooted. The red error messages on my screen vanished, replaced by green confirmation codes. The employee wages were finally distributed. A collective sigh of relief washed over the open plan office as phones buzzed with banking deposit notifications. The mid-level managers wiped the sweat from their foreheads, believing the earlier crash was just a temporary technical glitch. Up in the penthouse, my father and brother were undoubtedly pouring themselves expensive glasses of scotch, congratulating themselves on surviving their first major crisis. They thought they had outsmarted the market. They thought they had successfully swept Bradley's monumental stupidity under the rug. They did not understand that hard money loans were designed to consume the desperate. The $50 million would evaporate within weeks. It would cover the bounced payroll, satisfy the angry vendors, and maybe pay the docking fees for Bradley's useless yacht in Monaco. But it would not generate a single cent of new revenue. The corporate shell was still functionally dead, and now it was saddled with a predatory loan accumulating interest at a staggering daily rate. I looked up at the ceiling, picturing my father sitting in his usurped executive suite. He felt so powerful, so untouchable. He had mocked me, insulted my intelligence, and allowed his arrogant daughter-in-law to treat me like a peasant. He believed he was the undisputed king of Chicago real estate. He had no clue he was just a tenant living on borrowed time, and I was holding the eviction notice. The trap was fully loaded, locked, and armed. I had the legal authority to wipe out the company and strip my father of his personal wealth the moment he slipped up. All I had to do now was sit back, continue sipping my cheap break room coffee, and watch them march blindly toward their own spectacular destruction. Exactly 30 days passed. The trap I had so carefully set finally snapped shut. The predatory 25% interest rate on the $50 million bridge loan accrued with ruthless mathematical certainty. By 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon, the first massive interest payment was officially due to Apex Holdings. According to the secure alert flashing across my personal laptop, the corporate accounts had completely flatlined. My father had defaulted. I was sitting in the spacious living room of my downtown penthouse pouring myself a glass of vintage Cabernet. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning, unobstructed view of the Chicago skyline, the very city my father thought he still controlled. I had just taken my first sip when a violent, relentless pounding echoed through my front hallway. Whoever was at the door was not waiting for an invitation. The heavy knocking rattled the solid wood frame. I walked to the foyer and checked the security monitor. My father and brother were standing in the hallway looking utterly unhinged. Bradley was pacing back and forth, his custom suit wrinkled and his tie pulled loose. Richard was leaning heavily against the wall, his face pale and sweating. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Before I could even speak, Richard shoved his way past me, forcing the door wide open. Bradley followed immediately behind him, his eyes darting frantically around my apartment. They did not look like the arrogant corporate titans who had laughed at me in that private dining room a month ago. They looked like desperate cornered animals. "We have a massive crisis!" My father barked, his voice hoarse and trembling with barely suppressed panic. He marched directly into my living room, pacing across the expensive Persian rug. "The company is facing a temporary liquidity freeze, a minor cash flow issue that requires immediate internal capitalization. You are going to help us right now." I closed the front door slowly, making sure the lock clicked into place. I leaned against the foyer archway, holding my wine glass perfectly steady. "I recall you officially evicting me from this apartment 30 days ago, Richard. I also recall you telling me I was dead to you. Why are you breaking into my home on a Friday night?" Bradley stepped forward, pointing an aggressive finger at my face. "Do not play games with us right now, Sydney. We are completely out of time. A shadow lender is threatening to accelerate a massive corporate debt by midnight. If we do not wire them millions of dollars in interest payments immediately, they are going to seize the downtown headquarters. We need capital." "And what exactly does your catastrophic financial mismanagement have to do with me?" I asked coldly. My father stopped pacing and glared at me with absolute entitlement. "You are going to take out a maximum equity mortgage on this penthouse immediately. The commercial real estate division technically holds the master lease, but I can authorize an emergency equity pull against the property value if the tenant of record signs the authorization forms. We also need you to wire transfer every single cent of your personal savings, including your grandmother's trust fund, directly into the primary corporate account. We need liquid cash to stave off the creditors." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his demand actually made me smile. They had driven my grandfather's multi-billion-dollar empire straight into a brick wall in less than 30 days. Now facing complete public ruin, they had come crawling to the daughter they despised, demanding I destroy my own financial security to buy them a few more weeks of survival. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet apartment. "You want me to illegally leverage my home and drain my entire life savings to pay off a shadow lender because Bradley bought a mega yacht and gambled the employee payroll on an offshore crypto scam?" Bradley froze, his eyes widening in pure horror. The blood drained completely from his face. "How do you know about the yacht? How do you know about the crypto exchange that was highly classified executive information?" "I am a financial analyst, Bradley," I replied with lethal sarcasm. "I analyze financial disasters. Yours just happens to be the most spectacular failure I have ever witnessed." My father lunged forward, grabbing my upper arm with a bruising, desperate grip. The smell of stale scotch and panic radiated from his breath. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat. This is not a request. I am ordering you to sign the equity authorization forms. If that shadow lender seizes the corporate tower, the media will find out. The shareholders will riot. Jasmine's political family will abandon us. The entire legacy will collapse. I will not let you stand here and watch us lose everything." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, then looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes. "Take your hand off me, Richard, right now." He hesitated, his jaw clenching, but the absolute unshakable authority in my voice forced him to step back. He released my arm, his chest heaving as he tried to regain his composure. "I am not signing a single piece of paper," I stated, delivering the words like a physical blow. "I am not taking out a mortgage on this property. I am not giving you a single dollar from my personal accounts. You took out a predatory hard money loan to cover up your son's staggering incompetence. You signed the paperwork. You signed the personal guarantee. This is your funeral, Richard. I am just here to watch you get buried." Bradley let out a frustrated scream, kicking the side of my expensive glass coffee table. "You owe us. We gave you everything. You would be nothing without this family name. You are going to sign the papers, or I swear to God I will ruin you. You cannot even balance a corporate checking account, Bradley." I laughed, taking a slow sip of my wine. "You are completely powerless to ruin anyone. The company is dead. You killed it. And by midnight tonight, your shadow lender is going to strip you of every last asset you possess." My father's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He realized I was an immovable object. The daughter he had bullied and belittled for 3 decades was standing in front of him, entirely immune to his threats and manipulation. The panic in his eyes morphed into something deeply violent and unhinged. He had run out of options, and the reality of his total financial destruction was finally crashing down on his shoulders. He raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You think you have won because you are keeping your pathetic little savings account safe. You think you can defy me in my own building. I am still the owner of the master lease on this property. I am calling the building's security and the Chicago police right now. I am having you arrested for corporate insubordination and trespassing. You are going to be thrown onto the street with nothing but the clothes on your back." I watched him pull out his cell phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the numbers. He was operating on pure desperate adrenaline, grasping at the last shreds of his imaginary authority. He genuinely believed he could use law enforcement to force me out of my own home and seize the property to satisfy his catastrophic debts. "Go ahead," I said softly, stepping back and gesturing toward his phone. "Call the police, Richard. Call them right now. Tell them to come to this exact penthouse and remove the unauthorized occupant. Let us see exactly who the authorities decide to escort out of this building in handcuffs." My father glared at me, pressing the phone to his ear. He was about to learn a very painful lesson regarding actual property ownership. I set my wine glass down on the counter, calmly preparing to deliver the most devastating reality check of his entire arrogant life. Richard spoke rapidly into his phone, his voice dripping with the arrogant authority of a man who believed the entire city worked for him. "Yes, dispatch. I need officers at my downtown corporate penthouse immediately. I have a disgruntled former employee trespassing on company property. She is refusing to vacate and becoming hostile. Send a unit right away." He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his tailored suit pocket. His chest heaved as he glared at me, completely convinced he had just played the ultimate trump card. He took 2 aggressive steps forward, invading my personal space, trying to use his sheer physical size to break my resolve. "I am giving you one last chance to do the right thing." Richard snarled, his face inches from mine. "Sign the equity authorization forms. Transfer the liquid cash to the corporate accounts. If you do exactly what I tell you, I will call off the police and let you keep your miserable little life in this building. If you refuse, you are walking out of here in handcuffs." I did not back away. I looked directly into his desperate, bloodshot eyes and smiled. "I will never give you a single dime to cover up your failures. Your company is dead, Richard. Face it." The sharp, echoing crack of his hand striking my face silenced the room. Richard hit me with a vicious, unhinged backhand. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side and sent a stinging, burning sensation radiating across my left cheek. I tasted a faint metallic hint of blood where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip. Bradley gasped, taking a quick step back, genuinely shocked that his father had resorted to physical violence. I slowly turned my head back to face my father. I did not raise my hand to touch my cheek. I did not shed a single tear. I just stared at him with eyes as cold and dead as a winter ocean. He had just handed me the final piece of leverage I needed to completely destroy him. "You are nothing to me," Richard spat, his voice trembling with unchecked rage. "You hear me. You are no longer my daughter. I officially disown you. You are stripped of the family name. When the police drag you out of here, I want you to remember that you chose this. You brought this destruction entirely upon yourself." "I will be sure to remember that," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. We waited in suffocating silence. Bradley paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, nervously checking his luxury watch, occasionally shooting me vindictive, gloating glares. He genuinely believed he was about to watch his older sister get thrown onto the frigid Chicago streets. He thought the corporate empire was about to be saved by a forced real estate mortgage. His delusion was almost fascinating to observe. 10 minutes later, 3 heavy, authoritative knocks hammered against my front door. Richard practically lunged to open it. 2 uniformed Chicago police officers stood in the hallway looking serious and alert. My father instantly shifted into his practiced high society persona. He smoothed his wrinkled suit jacket and adopted the tone of a weary, victimized billionaire dealing with a tragic nuisance. "Officers, thank you for arriving so quickly," Richard said, stepping back to let them into the foyer. "I am the owner of the corporate real estate division that holds the master lease on this property. The woman standing right there is a recently terminated employee. We fired her for severe insubordination, and she is now refusing to vacate our corporate housing. I need her removed from the premises immediately." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, turned his attention to me. He placed a hand resting casually near his duty belt. "Ma'am, if the property belongs to this gentleman's corporation, you need to gather your personal belongings and exit the building. We do not want to escalate this to a trespassing arrest." Bradley smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. He was thoroughly enjoying the show. I calmly set my wine glass down on the kitchen counter. I walked over to the sleek console table near the entryway and opened the top drawer. I pulled out a thick certified legal portfolio sealed in a heavy plastic sleeve. I handed it directly to the lead officer. "Officers, I apologize that this man has entirely wasted your valuable time," I stated clearly. "He does not own this property. His corporate real estate division has absolutely no legal claim to this penthouse. I am the sole rightful owner." Richard let out a harsh, mocking bark of laughter. "Do not listen to her insane lies. She is completely delusional. The family trust owns this building." The officer ignored my father's outburst. He opened the plastic sleeve and pulled out the crisp, notarized documents. His eyes scanned the heavy legal text, jumping to the official county seals and the highlighted transfer of ownership records. "I purchased this property entirely in cash 2 years ago." I explained, projecting my voice so my father and brother could hear every single devastating syllable. "I used a proxy LLC to facilitate the transaction, which is why my father remained blissfully unaware that his real estate division had sold the master lease. If you look at the final page, officer, you will see my legal name listed as the absolute sole proprietor of that holding company. I own the concrete beneath his feet." The officer reviewed the final page, checking the embossed county seal. He closed the folder and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned to face my father, his stern expression hardening into outright annoyance. "Sir, this deed is perfectly valid and officially registered with the city of Chicago," the officer said firmly. "This woman owns the property outright. You have no authority to evict her. In fact, since you are not a resident and you are demanding her removal from her own home, you are the ones currently trespassing." The color drained completely from Richard's face. His jaw dropped open as he stared at the legal folder in my hands. The entire foundation of his arrogant reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "That is impossible," he stammered, his voice weak and breathy. "She is a mid-level analyst. She does not have the capital to buy a downtown penthouse outright. The paperwork has to be forged." "It is fully certified by the county clerk," the officer warned, stepping toward my father. "Now I suggest you and your son move toward the exit before the property owner presses charges against you." The realization that they could not leverage my home to save their collapsing empire finally hit Bradley. His one desperate lifeline had just been brutally severed. The $50 million debt acceleration was going to wipe them out completely, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Bradley completely snapped. His face twisted into a mask of pure childish fury. He let out an unhinged scream of sheer frustration. He spun around wildly, looking for a way to inflict damage, a way to punish me for outsmarting him. His eyes locked onto the pedestal near the dining room archway. Resting on top of the marble stand was a massive custom-commissioned bronze and glass sculpture I had acquired from a private gallery in Milan. "You ruined everything!" Bradley shrieked. He lunged toward the pedestal, grabbed the heavy sculpture with both hands, and hurled it violently against the hardwood floor. The impact sounded like a bomb going off. The heavy bronze base gouged a deep trench into the expensive wood, and the intricate blown glass shattered into 1,000 glittering shards that sprayed across the entire living room. The police officers reacted instantly. The lead officer shouted a command, closing the distance between himself and my brother in 2 massive strides. I pointed directly at the shattered wreckage covering my floor. "Officers, that was a certified imported Italian sculpture. Its appraised value is $22,000. I am officially pressing charges against him for felony property damage." "Get your hands behind your back right now," the lead officer barked, grabbing Bradley by the shoulder and spinning him around. Bradley panicked, trying to yank his arm away. "Let go of me. I am the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. You cannot arrest me." His resistance only made it worse. The second officer rushed in to assist. They slammed Bradley face first against the wall, forcefully pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of police handcuffs echoing through my penthouse was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. "Bradley!" Richard gasped, stepping forward in absolute horror, raising his hands in a futile gesture of surrender. "Officers, please wait. He is just under a lot of stress. I will write you a check right now to cover the damages. Just let him go." "Sir, step back immediately, or you will be arrested for interfering," the officer commanded, securing the cuffs tightly around Bradley's wrists. He began reading my brother his Miranda rights, his voice loud and authoritative over Bradley's sudden pathetic sobbing. The golden child, the arrogant heir who was supposed to rule the Chicago business world, was currently weeping like a toddler with his face pressed against my designer wallpaper. The officers hauled Bradley backward, pulling him roughly toward the front door. Richard followed them, completely broken, his hands hovering helplessly in the air as he watched his son being dragged away in chains. I stood perfectly still in the center of the foyer. As the officers pulled Bradley out into the hallway, Richard stopped at the threshold. He turned back to look at me one last time. The arrogant patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a defeated, terrified old man staring into the eyes of the monster he had created. "You have your eviction, Richard," I said, offering him a cold, merciless smile. "Now get off my property." The heavy oak door clicked shut, locking my father out of my home and out of my life. I walked over to the shattered Italian glass scattered across my hardwood floor. It was a mess, but it was a deeply satisfying one. I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Kensington. When he answered, his sharp, cultured voice echoed through the quiet penthouse. I informed him that Bradley had just been hauled away in handcuffs for felony property damage. I also instructed him to ensure our legal team pressed maximum charges. The seasoned attorney chuckled a dry and ruthless sound. He assured me the wheels were already in motion. My brother spent the entire weekend sitting in a sterile holding cell. Richard could not immediately post bail because the corporate accounts were completely frozen and his personal liquidity was locked up in the collateral agreements he had blindly signed with Apex Holdings. My father eventually had to pawn his prized collection of vintage Patek Philippe watches to a private dealer just to secure the cash to get his golden child out of jail by Monday morning. A rational man would have recognized that the war was lost. A sane corporate leader would have immediately filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, surrendered the remaining assets, and begged his creditors for mercy. But Richard and Bradley were entirely driven by their massive, fragile egos. Instead of surrendering, they chose the path of ultimate spectacular delusion. By Tuesday, sitting at my desk in the data division, I watched a brand new wave of sheer financial insanity flood the corporate shadow ledgers. Richard realized that the whispers of his company's demise were rapidly spreading through Chicago's financial district. The elite brokers knew about the bounced payroll, The society wives were still talking about Jasmine's counterfeit bag and her family's tax evasion scandal. To combat the impending social and financial execution, my father decided to deploy the oldest trick in the arrogant billionaire playbook. He threw a party. It was not just any party. Richard booked the grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton for an ultra-exclusive, multi-million-dollar charity gala. The official narrative was that the family corporation was celebrating a new era of visionary expansion under Bradley's leadership. The actual desperate reality was that Richard needed to pack a room full of high-net-worth investors, feed them expensive caviar, and convince them to write massive checks for a completely fabricated real estate project. He was trying to crowdfund a bailout to pay off the $50 million hard money loan he owed my shadow company. I pulled up the vendor invoices on my encrypted monitor. The spending was absolutely nauseating. My father was bleeding his last remaining personal credit lines dry to fund an illusion. He wired $200,000 to a luxury event planner. He authorized $50,000 for imported white orchids. He hired a Michelin-starred catering team and booked a Grammy-winning string quartet. Every single transaction was another anchor dragging him straight to the bottom of the ocean. The sheer scale of the delusion was fascinating to observe. Bradley had just been released from a county jail cell facing felony destruction of property charges. Yet he was strutting around the executive penthouse suite acting like a tech visionary, preparing for an initial public offering. He genuinely believed that if he wore a custom tuxedo and pitched a few buzzwords about synergy and modern logistics, Chicago's most ruthless venture capitalists would blindly hand him $50 million. Jasmine, still reeling from her total public humiliation at the Drake Hotel, saw the Ritz-Carlton Gala as her ultimate redemption arc. She desperately needed to reclaim her status as the untouchable corporate wife. Through the company network, I could see she had charged a staggering $80,000 diamond necklace to the company's emergency expense account. She was treating a sinking ship like her own personal shopping mall, determined to blind the high society wives with stolen brilliance. She wanted everyone to forget her rented dresses and her family's federal tax subpoenas. The invitations were dispatched by hand-delivered couriers to the wealthiest executives, hedge fund managers, and politicians in the state. Richard was pulling every single favor he had ever banked over the last 30 years. He was demanding attendance. The gala was scheduled for Saturday night, exactly 48 hours before the massive demand loan from Apex Holdings officially defaulted. It was a literal do-or-die scenario. I sat in my modest office chair, tracing the rim of my cheap coffee cup, mapping out the final sequence of my grandfather's brilliant trap. My father was building a magnificent, glittering stage. He was assembling the perfect audience of elite financial predators. He was setting up the spotlights and plugging in the microphones. He was doing all the heavy lifting required for his own public execution. The sheer poetry of it made me smile. Richard thought he was hosting a renaissance. He was actually hosting a wake. I opened my personal email and composed a secure message to Mr. Kensington. I instructed him to compile the final default notices, the forensic accounting reports detailing Bradley's offshore crypto fraud, and the unredacted proof of Richard's personal guarantee on the $50 million loan. I needed every single legal dagger sharpened and ready to deploy. My father wanted a spectacular show to prove to Wall Street that his empire was alive and thriving. I was going to give him a performance that the financial district would talk about for the next 50 years. I closed my laptop, packed my bag, and walked out of the corporate headquarters. The stage was set. It was time to prepare for the final act. As I walked to my car, I thought about the decades of subtle abuse, the constant belittling, and the overwhelming arrogance that had defined my existence in this family. For 33 years, I had been the scapegoat. I had been forced to stand in the shadows while men of inferior intellect and non-existent work ethic claimed the rewards of my grandfather's genius. Richard and Bradley had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my humility for poverty. They believed they were the apex predators simply because they wore the right suits and shouted the loudest. But true power did not need to shout. True power operated in the silence of encrypted hard drives and bulletproof legal contracts. Saturday night was rapidly approaching. The grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton was waiting. My father and my brother were going to put on their expensive tuxedos and walk into that luxury hotel, believing they were untouchable. I was going to walk in and remind them that the house always wins, and I owned the house. Thursday morning brought a brief, highly entertaining interruption to my meticulous legal preparations. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a dark roast coffee and reviewing the final default execution protocols Mr. Kensington had securely transmitted overnight. The corporate death warrant was fully drafted. I just needed to authorize the digital signatures. The heavy buzzer of my penthouse intercom echoed through the quiet foyer. I glanced at the security monitor to see the lobby concierge standing awkwardly next to a uniformed courier holding a cheap, battered cardboard box. The concierge apologized, stating the delivery required my direct signature and had been marked as extremely urgent by the sender. I authorized them to come up. 2 minutes later, I signed the electronic manifest and took the flimsy box into my living room. There was no return address, only my name scrawled in an overly elaborate looping cursive script that I immediately recognized. It was Jasmine's handwriting. She was clearly still spiraling from her total social annihilation at the Drake Hotel. A rational person facing a federal tax evasion investigation and public exposure as a fraud would keep their head down and hire a crisis management team. But Jasmine operated entirely on vanity and vindictiveness. She needed to strike back. She needed to prove to herself that she was still the untouchable corporate queen, and the only way she knew how to do that was by trying to drag me down to the dirt. I sliced the packing tape with a silver letter opener and pulled back the cardboard flaps. Inside the box lay a crumpled mass of stiff, low-grade black polyester and a cheap white button-down shirt. Resting on top of the fabric was a generic plastic name tag with a pin backing. The word server was stamped across the plastic in plain black letters. Tucked beneath the name tag was a piece of heavy gold embossed cardstock. I pulled the note out and read the looping cursive script. If you want to attend a family event, come pour the wine where you belong. You are not on the guest list, Sydney. Do not embarrass yourself by trying to walk through the front doors. Use the service elevator. I stood in the center of my multi-million-dollar penthouse, holding the pathetic polyester uniform, and let out a genuine sharp laugh. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. Almost. My father was currently suffocating under a $50 million predatory loan that was 48 hours away from defaulting. My brother was out on bail facing felony charges for destroying property in this exact room. The entire corporate empire was bleeding out on the operating table. Yet amidst all this catastrophic financial ruin, my brother's wife had taken the time to order a cheap catering uniform online, wrap it in a cardboard box, and pay a premium courier to deliver it to my home just to secure a petty social insult. They were playing high school mean girl games while I was orchestrating a hostile corporate takeover. The disconnect from reality was staggering. Jasmine genuinely believed this box would break me. She thought I would sit on my expensive hardwood floors and cry over being excluded from Richard's delusional charity gala. She thought she had successfully locked the gates to the kingdom, completely unaware that I owned the bank that held the mortgage to the castle. I picked up the cheap polyester uniform between my thumb and index finger. It smelled of industrial warehouse chemicals. I walked over to the kitchen and dropped the entire outfit name tag and malicious note directly into the stainless steel trash can. It was exactly where their pathetic attempts at intimidation belonged. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. In fact, Jasmine's childish stunt only solidified my absolute resolve. They wanted me to know my place. They wanted me to walk through the service elevators and serve them expensive champagne while they pretended to be billionaires. I was going to give them an unforgettable lesson in exactly where I belonged. I left the kitchen and walked down the wide hallway into my master bedroom, stepping through the double doors of my custom walk-in closet. I bypassed the racks of modest, unassuming gray and navy suits I wore to my corporate analyst job. I walked past the sensible flats and the practical winter coats. I went straight to the back of the closet where a biometric steel safe was built directly into the reinforced wall. I placed my thumb on the scanner. the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside hung a protective garment bag containing a dress I had commissioned months ago in Paris. I unzipped the heavy canvas. The Tom Ford gown inside was a masterpiece of lethal architectural elegance. It was cut from midnight blue silk that shifted like liquid shadow under the light. It was not a dress designed for a quiet analyst or a submissive daughter. It was a garment engineered for absolute dominance. But the dress was only the foundation of the execution. I reached into the lower compartment of the safe and pulled out a wide, heavy velvet box. The hinges gave a soft metallic sigh as I opened the lid. Resting against the black satin interior was the legendary diamond parure that had belonged to my grandmother. When my grandfather Theodore died, Richard had frantically searched the estate vaults for these exact diamonds. He had wanted to drape them around his new younger wife's neck to parade at charity balls. Bradley had wanted to sell them to fund his imported car collection. But Theodore had been 10 steps ahead. He had legally transferred ownership of the historic jewels to my private trust 5 years before his death. The necklace featured a cascade of flawless, brilliant cut diamonds anchored by a staggering sapphire pendant. It was a piece of jewelry that commanded the absolute attention of any room it entered. It was undeniable proof of generational wealth and true lineage. Jasmine wanted me to wear stiff polyester and pour her wine. Richard wanted me to grovel for my apartment. Bradley wanted me to bow to his unearned authority. I closed the velvet box and locked the safe. Saturday night was tomorrow. I was going to walk through the front doors of the grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton. I was going to wear my grandmother's diamonds. I was going to stand on their glittering, expensive stage and shatter their fabricated reality into a million pieces. The time for hiding in the data division was officially over. Saturday evening descended upon downtown Chicago with a crisp, biting chill that felt entirely appropriate for a corporate execution. The Ritz-Carlton was swarming with the city's financial elite. Black town cars and stretched limousines clogged the valet lane, discharging hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, and political heavyweights. My father had undoubtedly called in every single favor, debt, and obligation he possessed to pack the grand ballroom. He needed an audience of deep pockets to witness his fabricated renaissance. I sat in the back of my chauffeured Maybach, entirely relaxed against the pristine leather seating. My driver, a seasoned professional hired through Mr. Kensington's private security firm, navigated the chaotic hotel entrance with practiced ease. Through the tinted windows, I watched the high society wives wrapped in fur coats hurrying up the grand staircase. None of them had any idea they were attending a financial slaughter. I glanced down at my reflection in the darkened glass. The midnight blue Tom Ford gown fit like a second skin, its architectural lines projecting a lethal, uncompromising elegance. I had spent the last 5 years hiding my figure beneath shapeless gray blazers and sensible slacks to survive the hostile environment of the data division. Tonight, I was a weapon forged from silk and shadows. But the true masterpiece rested against my collarbone. My grandmother's diamond and sapphire parure felt heavy, a physical manifestation of generational power. The central sapphire caught the ambient streetlights, refracting a deep, piercing blue that demanded absolute submission. It was a piece of jewelry that could not be rented, borrowed, or faked. The Maybach glided to a halt at the absolute front of the valet line, aggressively bypassing a line of idling luxury SUVs. The hotel doorman hurried forward, pulling the heavy door open. I stepped out onto the pavement. The crisp night air hit my bare shoulders, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins kept me perfectly warm. A few freelance photographers lingering near the entrance immediately raised their cameras, their flashes firing rapidly as they tried to identify the woman wearing millions of dollars in historic gems. I walked through the opulent lobby, the click of my heels rhythmic and unhurried. I bypassed the main registration desks and headed straight for the grand staircase leading to the ballroom level. 2 private security guards stood at the top of the stairs checking physical invitations on clipboards. I did not slow my pace. I simply locked eyes with the head of security, a man who worked for the very firm my shadow company held a controlling stake in. He instantly recognized me, unhooked the velvet rope without a single word, and bowed his head respectfully as I glided past. Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly arrogant. A string quartet played a lively classical piece over the hum of hundreds of wealthy voices. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. I paused in the shadows near the entrance, surveying the room. My father was standing near the center ice sculpture, laughing loudly with a group of investment bankers. He was desperately trying to project an aura of untouchable success, swirling his whiskey glass and clapping men on the shoulder. Bradley was near the bar, holding a tumbler of scotch, aggressively gesturing as he pitched his catastrophic business vision to anyone forced to listen. He looked manic, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. And then there was my sister-in-law. Jasmine was draped in a silver sequined dress, her neck weighed down by the $80,000 diamond necklace she had illegally charged to the dying corporate treasury. She was clinging to the edge of a wealthy social circle, desperately trying to ignore the side eyes and cold shoulders directed at her following her humiliation at the Drake Hotel. She kept touching the stolen necklace, clearly hoping the sparkling stones would buy back her shattered reputation. They were all playing their parts perfectly, completely unaware that the curtain was about to fall. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the blinding crystalline light of the grand ballroom. The shift in the room was not immediate, but it spread like a fast-moving virus. A woman standing near the entryway gasped audibly, her champagne glass slipping slightly in her hand. The man beside her turned, his eyes locking onto the heavy sapphire resting against my chest. The conversations closest to the door abruptly died. The silence rippled outward, a wave of stunned, breathless awe moving through the packed ballroom. Within 30 seconds, the deafening roar of high society networking evaporated. Even the string quartet faltered, the lead cellist losing his place in the sheet music as he stared. Hundreds of Chicago's most powerful, ruthless financial predators completely stopped talking. They parted like the Red Sea, automatically stepping aside to clear a wide, unobstructed path down the center of the room. I walked down that path with my head held high, my posture projecting absolute sovereign authority. I did not look like a disgraced daughter or a disgruntled employee. I looked like royalty. Every single eye in the room was fixed on me. The heavy diamonds caught the chandelier light, throwing brilliant, blinding sparks across the silent crowd. At the center of the room, my father's booming laugh died in his throat. He turned to see what had silenced his crucial investors. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw fell slack. Bradley dropped his glass of scotch. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud, the amber liquid soaking into his expensive shoes. He stumbled backward, knocking into a cocktail table as he recognized the woman he had tried to arrest just days prior. Jasmine stared at me, her eyes bulging in pure, unfiltered terror. She recognized the historic family diamonds, instantly realizing in a fraction of a second that the $80,000 necklace she wore was nothing but cheap glass compared to the absolute, undeniable power currently walking toward them. My father was the first to break out of the paralyzing shock. The ashen gray of his face rapidly morphed into a violent, mottled purple. His entire body trembled with a rage so profound it seemed to vibrate the floorboards beneath him. In his narrow, arrogant mind, my presence here was the ultimate act of disrespect. He believed I had somehow stolen my grandmother's diamonds, bypassed his security, and crashed his carefully curated financial lifeline just to spite him. He had absolutely no idea that I was the very lifeline he was desperately trying to grasp. Richard frantically waved his hand in the air, catching the attention of the lead security director standing near the main stage. My father aggressively pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my chest, then jerked his thumb toward the exit. He was ordering them to physically grab me, to drag me out of the grand ballroom in front of Chicago's wealthiest investors, to humiliate me exactly as he had always dreamed of doing. 3 large men in dark suits immediately detached themselves from the perimeter of the room and began moving toward me. Their earpieces buzzed as they coordinated the removal of the supposedly deranged, uninvited daughter. The society wives around me took a collective step back, eager to avoid being caught in the physical altercation. They clutched their champagne flutes, watching with morbid fascination as the guards closed the distance. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still in my Tom Ford gown, my chin raised, letting the heavy sapphire resting against my collarbone catch the blinding light of the chandeliers. I watched the security detail advance with total icy detachment. I knew exactly what time it was. I knew exactly what was scheduled to happen next. I had orchestrated this precise timeline with Mr. Kensington down to the very last second. The lead guard reached out his large hand, extending to grasp my bare shoulder. A sharp, piercing whistle of microphone feedback suddenly echoed across the vast ballroom, instantly freezing the security guards in their tracks. Every head in the room snapped toward the main stage. Standing behind the crystal podium was the master of ceremonies, a highly respected former banking executive. Richard had paid a small fortune to host the evening. The man held a gold-embossed cue card in his hand, adjusting his reading glasses as he tapped the microphone to ensure he had the absolute attention of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, his booming, authoritative voice reverberating off the gilded ceilings. "If I could please direct your attention to the center of the room. Before we commence the formal presentations regarding the corporate expansion, leadership has requested we take a moment to honor the most crucial presence in the building tonight." Richard frowned, lowering his pointing finger. This was not in his original script. He looked at Bradley, who merely shrugged in blind, terrified confusion. My father had planned to use the middle of the gala to pitch his desperate fundraising scheme, but the schedule was suddenly moving entirely on its own. "As you all know," the MC continued, projecting his voice over the hushed crowd, "the continued dominance and visionary future of this historic logistics empire requires immense, unwavering financial backing. Tonight, we are incredibly honored to be joined by the singular force underwriting that future. This individual represents the absolute pinnacle of private equity and strategic investment in the Midwest." The elite hedge fund managers and venture capitalists in the room began murmuring to each other, their eyes scanning the crowd to see which billionaire titan had secretly stepped in to save Richard's sinking ship. They knew the company was bleeding cash. They were all here to see who was brave enough or wealthy enough to plug the hole. Richard's chest puffed out slightly. Even in his confusion, his massive ego convinced him that this was a surprise introduction orchestrated by one of his brokers. He genuinely believed an offshore billionaire was about to step onto the stage and hand him a blank check. He smoothed his tuxedo jacket and prepared to clap. "Please direct your applause to the center aisle," the MC commanded, raising his hand in a grand, sweeping gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our primary underwriter, the ultimate visionary, and the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings." The main spotlight operator in the balcony perfectly executed the directive. A blinding, pure white beam of light sliced through the dim elegance of the ballroom. It did not swing toward the VIP tables near the stage. It did not search the executive booths. The spotlight swung directly down the center aisle and locked firmly, undeniably, onto me. The three security guards, who had been inches away from grabbing my arm, recoiled as if they had just been struck by lightning. They stumbled backward into the crowd, their faces draining of color as they realized they had almost physically assaulted the most powerful investor in the room. The silence that fell over the Ritz-Carlton ballroom was absolute and deafening. Hundreds of the most ruthless financial minds in Chicago stared at the woman bathed in the spotlight. They looked at the heavy historic diamonds around my neck. They looked at my uncompromising, predatory posture. Then they connected the dots. The supposedly unstable, destitute daughter was the mysterious billionaire savior. My father literally stopped breathing. His eyes bulged out of his head, locked onto the spotlight, illuminating my face. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. Apex Holdings, the shadow lender, the predatory hard money loan, the $50 million debt that was currently suffocating his entire existence. It all rushed into his narrow mind in one catastrophic, mind-shattering wave. Bradley let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, gripping the edge of a cocktail table to keep his knees from buckling. Jasmine pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror, as she stared at the woman she had tried to force into a catering uniform just 48 hours ago. I did not break eye contact with my father. I let the silence stretch, letting the sheer terrifying weight of the moment crush the last remaining fragments of his arrogance. I offered him a cold, lethal smile, stepping smoothly forward into the spotlight. I had been invited to pour the wine, but I was here to collect the debt. I moved down the center aisle, the heavy silk of my gown whispering against the carpeted floor. The 3 security guards who had been ordered to drag me out now shrank back against the velvet-draped walls, keeping their hands strictly at their sides. They recognized absolute authority when it walked past them. The city's most ruthless venture capitalist men who managed billions in assets held their breath as I passed their tables. As I approached the front of the ballroom, I saw my father desperately trying to process the catastrophic reality unfolding before his eyes. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish producing no sound. He took a hesitant, trembling step toward me, his hands outstretched in a pathetic, pleading gesture. He wanted to stop me. He wanted to intercept me before I reached the stairs to the main stage, but the paralyzing weight of the public spotlight kept him anchored to the floor. Bradley was entirely broken. He leaned heavily against a high-top cocktail table, his face covered in a sheen of terrified sweat. His eyes were wide and frantic, darting from the historic diamonds resting against my collarbone to the microphone waiting on the podium. He knew his fraudulent crypto investments and his absurd mega yacht purchase were about to be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. Beside him, Jasmine had physically curled in on herself, desperately trying to hide her counterfeit necklace behind her clutch. The arrogant woman who had ordered me to use the service elevator was currently trying to make herself invisible. I did not spare them a single glance as I walked past. They were no longer threats. They were just obstacles I had already cleared. I ascended the carpeted steps to the grand stage with measured, predatory grace. The master of ceremonies, a man who understood the brutal hierarchy of corporate finance better than anyone, immediately took a respectful step backward. He offered a slight deferential bow and handed me the crystal microphone. His job was done. The real power had arrived. I turned to face the packed ballroom. The blinding glare of the spotlight washed over me, illuminating the sapphire pendant and projecting a massive, commanding silhouette against the back wall. Hundreds of wealthy investors stared up at me in absolute silence, waiting for the billionaire savior to speak. Down in the front row, Richard stood perfectly rigid, his face an agonizing portrait of impending doom. I raised the microphone, my voice echoing crystal clear through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Hello," I began, my tone calm, steady, and utterly lethal. "I am Sydney, CEO of Apex Holdings, and I am the legal creditor holding the deed to 100% of the assets this company just leveraged." The reaction was instantaneous. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the entire ballroom. The elite financial predators in the audience were exceptionally quick to understand the math. They had been invited tonight under the pretense of investing in a thriving, modernizing corporate empire. Now, the CEO of an offshore holding firm was standing on stage explicitly stating that she already owned the very assets they were supposed to be funding. My father staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. He gripped the edge of a chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The public confirmation of my identity shattered his last desperate hope that this was all just a bizarre misunderstanding. "Many of you were invited here tonight to celebrate a new era of visionary expansion." I continued, projecting my voice smoothly across the shocked crowd. "You were offered the rare opportunity to inject your private capital into a historic logistics and real estate syndicate. You were told that the new leadership required immediate liquidity to modernize their infrastructure and acquire new international targets." I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the audience before locking dead onto my father's horrified face. That was a lie. A chaotic murmur erupted among the hedge fund managers and bank executives. Cell phones were immediately pulled from tuxedo pockets as men began frantically texting their analysts and risk assessment teams. "There is no expansion," I stated, my voice slicing through the rising panic in the room like a scalpel. "The corporation hosting this multi-million-dollar gala is functionally insolvent. Over the past 5 years, the core profitable logistics network and the prime commercial real estate portfolios were legally divested. The entity you see before you today is nothing but a hollow shell drowning in operational overhead and catastrophic internal debt. Bradley let out a loud, pathetic sob from his corner of the room. Several investors standing near him physically stepped away, disgusted by his display of weakness. Less than 48 hours ago, I announced holding the absolute attention of the room. The current leadership realized they could not even cover their basic employee payroll. To avoid immediate public bankruptcy, the new chief executive officer and his father sought a highly predatory $50 million bridge loan from my firm. They used the downtown corporate headquarters as their primary collateral. The murmurs turned into outright exclamations of shock and anger. The investors realized exactly how close they had come to throwing their money into a roaring fire. Richard had tried to use their investments to pay off my shadow loan. It was a textbook desperate scam, and I was burning it to the ground in front of his entire social and professional circle. They believed they were outsmarting the market. I said, a cold smile touching my lips. They believed they could mask their staggering incompetence behind expensive champagne and rented ballroom spaces. But in the world of high finance, arrogance is a very expensive liability. And tonight, the bill has officially come due. I looked down at Richard. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of every ounce of the vicious superiority he had wielded over me for my entire life. He was a dead man walking, and he finally knew it. I stood on the stage he had built, wearing the diamonds he had coveted, executing the flawless trap my grandfather had designed. The empire was officially mine, and the corporate execution was only just beginning. From the shadows of the stage wing, Mr. Kensington emerged. He did not walk alone. Two junior associates from his prestigious law firm followed closely behind him, each carrying heavy combination-locked leather briefcases. The rhythmic, authoritative click of the veteran attorney's silver-handled cane against the polished wooden stage floor sounded exactly like the ticking of a countdown clock. He stopped at my right side, offering a brief clinical nod to the audience before gesturing sharply to his associates. The two younger lawyers stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward the VIP tables. They unlocked the briefcases and began distributing thick, glossy black dossiers to the heavy hitters seated in the front row. The top-tier venture capitalists, the senior hedge fund managers, and the elite banking executives, who had been personally invited by my father, eagerly snatched up the folders. They ripped them open, their eyes instantly scanning the heavily audited, unredacted financial reports compiled by my private forensic accounting team. If you turn to the first page of the dossier, I instructed, my voice cutting through the rustle of turning pages, you will see the exact trajectory of the new chief executive officer's strategic vision. I pointed directly at Bradley, who was now clutching the edge of a high-top cocktail table so hard his knuckles were stark white. He looked physically ill, swaying slightly under the crushing weight of the spotlight. Within 48 hours of assuming command, I continued ensuring every single syllable echoed perfectly across the grand ballroom. My brother executed two incredibly visionary transactions. First, he authorized an $80 million corporate line of credit to purchase a custom mega yacht currently docked in Monaco. He classified this ridiculous luxury vessel as a vital entertainment expense to lure international clients. A collective, disgusted scoff rippled through the front row of investors. Men who managed real wealth despised nothing more than reckless, unearned extravagance. But he did not stop there. I said, my tone dropping to a sharp, merciless register. To cover the massive hole he had just blown into the corporate treasury, Bradley wired the remaining operational cash, including the funds required for employee payroll, into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. It was a blatant Ponzi scheme heavily promoted by internet influencers. Within 24 hours, the exchange halted all global withdrawals. The founders vanished. The entire corporate cash reserve evaporated into the digital ether. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of outraged whispers. The elite financial predators were looking at Bradley not just as a failure, but as a total liability. They viewed him with absolute revulsion. I shifted my gaze back to my father. Richard looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner place the lever in position. Faced with a highly public, humiliating insolvency during his son's first week in power, Richard sought a $50 million bridge loan. I announced the crystal microphone, amplifying the absolute finality in my voice. He needed cash fast, and he needed it from a shadow lender who would not ask questions or demand a forensic audit. Apex Holdings provided that loan. The interest rate was set at a predatory 25%. It was a demand loan with a strict cross-default clause. And because the original company failed to meet its initial interest obligations at 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon, that $50 million loan is now officially in catastrophic default. Mr. Kensington stepped up to the secondary microphone on the podium. His voice was gravelly precise and entirely devoid of mercy. Under the laws of the state of Illinois, Apex Holdings has officially accelerated the debt the attorney declared to the silent room. The entire principal and all accrued penalties are due immediately. We have already filed the necessary injunctions to freeze the debtor's remaining operations. The corporate entity is in total default. I raised my hand to silence the rising panic and outrage in the ballroom. The wealthy attendees were practically salivating at the brutal corporate takedown happening live in front of them. But the $50 million debt is not simply secured by the downtown corporate headquarters, I revealed, saving the most devastating twist for last. My father was so desperate to hide his son's monumental incompetence, so utterly terrified of losing his social standing, that he failed to read the fine print on the final page of the contract. Richard grabbed his chest. His breathing turned ragged and shallow. He knew exactly what I was about to say, and the sheer terror of it was finally breaking his mind. Richard signed a binding, irrevocable personal guarantee, I declared, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. He legally bound his entire private fortune to this toxic debt. Therefore, effective as of this precise moment, Apex Holdings is executing a total asset seizure. I looked down from the stage, staring directly into my father's horrified, watering eyes. I am not just taking the corporate skyscraper, I told him, my voice devoid of any familial warmth. I am legally seizing your sprawling suburban mansion. I am repossessing your vintage car collection. I am freezing and seizing every single one of your personal bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and your private trusts. You traded your entire life to cover up a mistake, Richard. And now I am collecting. The total destruction of his wealth hit the room with the force of a bomb. The investors in the front row physically stepped back from Richard, treating him like a contagious disease. In their world, a man who signed a blind personal guarantee and lost his entire fortune was worse than dead. He was a pariah. Jasmine let out a sharp, hysterical wail. She grabbed her hair, completely losing her balance and collapsing onto the carpeted floor in her cheap rented dress and her stolen diamonds. The realization that she was no longer a wealthy corporate wife, that her husband was a criminal fraud, and that her father-in-law was entirely bankrupt had shattered her fragile reality. She was going to wake up tomorrow with absolutely nothing. Bradley fell to his knees beside a cocktail table, openly weeping in front of Chicago's most powerful executives. The golden child was entirely broken, stripped of his unearned arrogance, and left to face the devastating consequences of his own stupidity. My father could not speak. He could not scream. The sheer magnitude of his loss had paralyzed his vocal cords. He stared up at the stage, looking at the daughter he had abused, discarded, and underestimated for 33 years. He was entirely bankrupt, utterly humiliated, and completely at my mercy. And I had none left to give. The crushing reality of absolute ruin did not bring my family together in a display of tragic solidarity. Instead, it stripped away the last remaining layers of their manufactured loyalty and turned them into feral animals fighting over the scraps of a sunken ship. Bradley was the first to completely break. The golden child who had spent his entire life hiding behind my father's massive shadow suddenly realized that the shadow was gone. He looked around the silent ballroom, his eyes darting frantically across the faces of the venture capitalists who were currently viewing him with sheer, unadulterated disgust. He realized he was not just broke. He was facing federal fraud charges for the crypto embezzlement and felony property damage for my penthouse. He scrambled up from his knees, his face twisted in a panicked, ugly snarl, and turned entirely against the man who had enabled him his entire life. Bradley lunged at my father, grabbing Richard by the lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo. "You did this to me!" Bradley shrieked, his voice echoing violently through the microphone feedback. "You handed me a dead company. You told me to be an aggressive visionary. You made me sign those papers for the yacht." Richard tried to push his son away, his hands trembling violently. "Shut your mouth, Bradley. Stop embarrassing yourself." "I am going to prison because of you," Bradley screamed, spit flying from his lips as he shook the old man. "You told me the company was flush with cash. You forced me into the CEO chair. You let her trap us. You lost the money, you lost everything." The display was profoundly pathetic. The patriarch and the heir, the two arrogant men who had spent decades belittling my intelligence, were now physically shoving each other in the middle of the Ritz-Carlton. The elite investors in the front row simply watched with clinical detachment. In the corporate world, weakness was a terminal disease, and my father and brother were currently bleeding out on the ballroom carpet. A few feet away, Jasmine was hyperventilating. Her fake Hermes bag lay abandoned, and the stolen $80,000 corporate necklace hung heavily around her neck, a gleaming reminder of the criminal fraud she was now complicit in. She looked up at her husband, who was currently weeping and screaming at his father, and the final thread of her sanity snapped. Her family's political standing was already being dismantled by the IRS. Her only remaining lifeline was the billionaire status of the family she had married into. Now she realized she was legally bound to a penniless, fraudulent felon. "You are absolutely useless," Jasmine wailed, slapping her hands against the floor. She stared at Bradley with a look of pure, concentrated venom. "I married you because you were supposed to be an heir. You are nothing. You are a broke, pathetic loser, and I am ruined. I am socially dead because of you." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. A few of the society wives in the crowd actually pulled out their smartphones mercilessly, recording the downfall of the woman who had spent years treating them with arrogant condescension. My father shoved Bradley backward, sending his golden boy stumbling into a tray of empty champagne flutes. Richard turned back toward the stage. The anger that had fueled him for 60 years had completely evaporated. The realization that his mansion, his cars, his bank accounts, and his entire identity were legally gone finally crushed the last stubborn pillar of his ego. He looked up at me standing behind the crystal podium. He saw the cold, sovereign authority in my posture. He saw Mr. Kensington standing loyally by my side, holding the execution documents. He saw my grandmother's legendary diamonds resting against my collarbone, illuminating the undeniable truth that I was the only true successor to the family empire. Richard approached the edge of the stage. His legs gave out. The proud, tyrannical patriarch of Chicago real estate fell heavily to his knees in front of hundreds of the city's most elite financial predators. He looked up at me, his face slick with sweat and tears, his shoulders trembling. He raised his hands in a desperate, shattered plea for mercy. "Sydney, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former booming authority. "Please do not do this. You cannot take my home. You cannot take everything I have worked for. I am your father. I am the man who raised you. We share the same blood." The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The venture capitalists, the hedge fund managers, the society wives all waited to see if the newly crowned billionaire CEO would show a single ounce of compassion to the man pleading at her feet. I looked down at the broken man kneeling on the carpet. I thought about the years of emotional starvation. I thought about the constant grueling comparisons to a brother who possessed a fraction of my capability. I thought about the $15,000 dinner bill he had slid across the mahogany table, with a cruel, satisfied smirk, utterly convinced he had permanently destroyed my future. I gripped the edges of the crystal podium and leaned forward, ensuring the microphone picked up the icy, absolute finality of my voice. "The day you kicked me out," I said, my words slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom like a polished steel blade. "You looked me in the eye and said I wouldn't get a single cent. You told me I was nothing but an employee. Richard sobbed, lowering his head. I was wrong. I was angry, please. You were not wrong. I corrected my voice, dropping to a lethal, unwavering register. You were completely right. I didn't get a single cent. I let the silence hang for a fraction of a second before delivering the final fatal strike. I took everything. The collective gasp that rippled through the audience was the sound of absolute victory. Richard collapsed forward, his forehead resting against the carpeted stairs of the stage, utterly destroyed. I stepped back from the podium. I did not offer him another glance. I turned to Mr. Kensington, who offered me a deep, reverent bow of profound respect. The veteran attorney knew that Theodore's empire was finally safe in the hands of the true apex predator. I walked down the side stairs of the stage, bypassing the weeping remnants of my family. The crowd of billionaires and power brokers parted seamlessly for me, lowering their heads in silent deference as I glided through the grand ballroom. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out of the Ritz-Carlton, walking directly into the crisp, cool Chicago night. The city lights sparkled brilliantly against the dark sky, welcoming me to my new kingdom, leaving my toxic family to choke on the ashes of their own spectacular greed. As an AI processing this dramatic narrative, I see a profound lesson about self-worth and strategic boundaries. Sydney's journey teaches us that true power never requires shouting or begging for validation from those committed to undervaluing you. While her toxic family demanded absolute submission, she quietly secured her financial independence. Her story proves that competence and unbreakable boundaries are the ultimate defenses against narcissistic manipulation. You never have to accept the diminishing roles others assign to you. You can silently build the leverage to rewrite your own life. Share a time you walked away from toxicity in the comments below.